Hello again. I want to start this lecture by looking at the claims made on the Leave side about why the single market does not serve British interests sufficiently well. If you remember from the introductory video for this week's topic, complaints about the single market relate to the constraints it places on British autonomy. But in addition to the more abstract concern about democratic self-government, the concrete worry here is that a one-size-fits-all EU approach undermines British competitiveness. So here's another powerful image coming from the official Vote Leave campaign. They're outlining 4 key arguments against participating in the EU single market. Now, as with all images presented in these lectures, this one is available on the course website, so you can always go back and study it again later. For now, let's focus on the first box on the left. After we vote Leave, British businesses will trade freely with the EU. Many countries around the world trade with the EU without accepting the supremacy of EU law. That's what the Leave campaign is saying. And by mentioning the problem of the supremacy of EU law, it seems to be taking us back to the more abstract problem of sovereignty and democratic control that we looked at last week. However, in this particular context, I think there's a more distinctive argument being made. The clue is in the next box, the second to the left. There, that's telling us that only 6% of British firms trade with the EU, and that in any case, this is a declining market for British exporters. We can quibble about those particular figures, but roughly speaking, they're empirically valid. And what's really interesting, though, is the implication this has for continued British participation in the single market. And here I think we need to read a bit between the lines, which may be a little surprising, as potentially there's an even more potent message going on here. Basically, the Leave camp is highlighting that there are plenty of countries that trade with the European Union. For instance, the US or Canada, and they do so without having to accept the principle of free movement of people, goods, capital, and services. As you recall from the introductory video for this week, those 4 freedoms constitute the foundation of the single market. Thus, in an age of globalization, it is possible to trade with the EU without running the risk, as we saw last week, of being outvoted in Brussels. Additionally, the 6% figure regarding firms that actually export to the EU is significant because the primary justification of transferring policy competencies to Brussels is to allow the EU to put in place a level playing field. But if so few companies actually benefit and the volume of trade is declining, why put up with such constraints? I'm not going to answer this question myself, as it's a judgment citizens should make for themselves. Rather, over the course of this lecture, I want to present some relevant information to allow you to determine what you think the answer might be. In order to do this, it's useful to first explore exactly how constraining EU rules are on British business. Here's an image then to help us understand the impact of the single market in a very important area when it comes to doing business: employment protection. The ability, in essence, to hire and fire employees. Now, this is a chart that tries to put into comparative perspective the constraints under which British firms operate when it comes to employment regulation. The figure comes from a report produced by the Centre for European Reform, which is a pro-EU think tank. But before we get sidetracked by issues of bias, we need to know that the raw data itself comes from the independent OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's the OECD that has ranked the level of employment protection across the developed countries that make up this institution. Now, what the figure shows is that EU membership does not mean that the rules on employment contracts redundancy rights, industrial relations, etc. are harmonized. So in this fundamental area of business regulation, there isn't a single set of EU rules. Rather, member states of the EU can adopt a diverse set of policies, as seen by the fact that there are countries to the right of the UK, and these include Germany, Spain, and France. You look at the UK, it's much further to the left than those countries in the chart because the rules on employment are fewer, less onerous on businesses. Therefore, in a key area that affects competitiveness, EU rules are not that constraining for British businesses. However, we ought to note that Canada and the US are further to the left in this chart. It's easier, in essence, to hire and fire employees there. It is possible, that is, to have even more deregulated labour markets than what the UK currently has. And importantly, one of the main reasons the UK isn't closer to that North American model is because the EU has legislated to provide certain employment rights to temporary workers. Another major area of single market regulation is the environment. Now, in this policy field, the EU does create common rules, and it does so across a diverse set of issues such as air pollution, car emissions, water cleanliness. And complying with such rules can be costly, and there's no possibility of opting out. Consequently, outside the single market, there would be the option for the UK government to lower certain employment and environmental standards. That's why the Remain campaign, which produced the following image here, is warning that Brexit, leaving the EU, would be bad for environmental protection. The slogan here is, being in Europe makes Britain cleaner and greener. But note, it's not that environmental standards would disappear automatically. They are part of UK law. The things that are actually being referred to in this image are enshrined in British legal texts. But legally, being outside the single market makes it possible to legislate for less labour and environmental regulation than the current EU minimums. And that's certainly what some businesses advocate. In the event of a UK withdrawal, it might be tempting to cut such standards in order to make British businesses more competitive internationally. However, when discussing the advantage of being able to leave behind EU rules, we should note something about just how competitive one can be within the single market. Here's a ranking of global competitiveness. Which economies are most globally competitive? A ranking produced by the World Economic Forum, covering 2015-2016. Now here are the top 10. Of these, we have to note that 6 of the 10 most competitive economies in the world participate in the single market. There's the UK down in 10th place, which is great still from a global perspective, with 4 other EU countries, plus in first position, Switzerland, not an EU country, but a country that actually participates in the single market. So what this goes to show is that there's more to competitiveness than just having low regulatory standards. You can use this opportunity to note down in your personal journal what kind of regulation the UK should or shouldn't keep in things like employment law or environmental protection. In the next section, I will look at how non-EU countries, like the Swiss example that I've just mentioned, how they participate in the single market and what this implies for the UK if voters choose to reject EU membership.